We are. You can go ahead and get started.
Great.
Fantastic. Go ahead, Barbara.
Good afternoon, everybody, and I hope you enjoyed this morning's session as much as I did. Quite informative and inspirational. Nani Coloretti, a Bethesda resident and an administrative manager and budget guru, also is no stranger to Maryland, as well as to all levels of government and national organizations. She is the Senior Vice President for Financial and Business Strategy at the Urban Institute. She served in the Obama administration for almost all of his 2 terms, most recently as Deputy Secretary of the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. As the second most senior official at HUD, she managed the department's day-to-day operations, which is no easy task, and cross-cutting programs initiative, including a $45 billion annual budget and approximately 8,000 employees. Before joining HUD, Nani spent 5 years at the U.S. Department of Treasury, most recently as the Assistant Secretary for Management. She oversaw all the operational areas, including the development and execution of the department's budget, performance and strategic planning processes, procurement, human resources, information technology, and management of the Treasury's headquarters and bureaus. That is a full plate. At Treasury, she also helped create the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau as its acting chief operating officer. Nani is a shining star, not just over Maryland, but all across the United States. Before joining the Obama administration in 2009, Nani spent 4 years as policy advisor and budget director for San Francisco Mayor Gavin Newsom. Her prior experience includes working in San Francisco to improve the lives of children, youth, and families, budget analysis in the Clinton administration's Office of Management and Budget, and for the state of Hawaii and economic consulting. It is our honor and pleasure to welcome her to the Affordable Housing Conference family, and I turn it over to you now, Nani.
Thank you so much, Barbara. That was such a lovely, lovely introduction. Really excited to do this panel. We have a really great set of panelists, and what I'm going to do first is share some of the work that we're doing at the Urban Institute, where I currently am, and hope that that helps set the stage for a really great conversation about fair housing. And just as a side note, one of the things I was really proud to work on as Deputy Secretary of HUD was the 2015 Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing Rules. So I have a little bit of exposure to that, but my panelists are going to be experts in this and also in how to increase opportunity for all. So I'm going to share screen so that everybody can sort of see, kind of get a little presentation here, get us going. So we at Urban Institute are doing a whole bunch of things, but one of the things we recently launched was an essay series on opportunity for all. And this is really a place on our website you can find exploring ways that the federal government can help all neighborhoods become places of opportunity and inclusion. And so it really just highlights how important it is for the federal government to get involved and use the full range of tools at their disposal, both administrative and legislative, to help address housing disparities. And as you all know, we're in a major, major housing crunch at all income levels, but we also know that the federal government contributed to incredible discrimination in housing that we now need to fix and address. And for over 50 years have had fair housing legislation in place that can help be one of many tools to help do this. Some of the things that we have think can both boost housing supply and address equity and inclusion in housing are really a place. We've kind of talked about this on the Opportunity for All essay series, but place conscious framework for federal policies and investments, a national housing preservation strategy, renter housing stability. We've been doing a lot of work on what's happening in the rental housing market since COVID, inclusionary zoning, and really more mobility for housing choice vouchers, one of the many ways in which the federal government subsidizes housing just to give you a little snapshot, I liked this chart, so I wanted to bring it here and show it to you all. These are some of the legislation, just a sampling of legislation that's right now before Congress. And many of these, I'm not going to read through them all, just let you take a look at them here. But many of these are trying to address housing supply in a couple of ways, incentivizing them, such as through this Build More Housing Near Transit Moving Forward Act, where you might tie existing grant money to methods to increase housing and increase housing inclusion. And then also just putting more money in the system. The American Jobs Plan that was just released by President Biden and is a bill in Congress has $213 billion in it to build, preserve, and retrofit homes, commercial buildings through tax credits, formula funding, grants, and project-based rental assistance. For example, there are also other tools in the American Jobs Plan, such as a provision that works to eliminate exclusionary land use patterns through a new grant program that would award flexible and attractive funding to jurisdictions to take steps, encourage them to take steps to produce affordable housing. So all of these policies are really more carrot in nature rather than stick, meaning they, are just working to encourage localities to produce different types of land use regulation and also housing supply, but they're not requirements. So there's a lot more that we can be done, and I'll be turning to my panelists soon to tell you what they're seeing happen and what they think might be coming in the future. But so for now, if you visit our website, you'll see a lot of ideas and ways to boost supply, and we are also working with intent on efforts to connect zoning reforms with expanding access to affordable housing. And this is because we've learned over time that really a lot of this action happens at the local level. So for example, we're estimating the effect of specific zoning policies on housing supply, affordability, and access to opportunity-rich places. These are the places like Montgomery County. I consider Montgomery County to be an opportunity-rich place. And we're also developing new ideas to work with policymakers to design and assess policy options. So soon in the fall, we'll be launching a land use lab at Urban. And it's going to be a place where you can unlock data about policy reforms. We're going to be building evidence base about local zoning, and we aim to inform policymakers really at every level about this so that people can kind of drag and drop ideas and try them out. We hope. We hope that's what it'll encourage. So that's just a quick kind of set of information about what we're doing and what we've learned so far about what's happening. And we really tie fair housing to equitable housing, but this is a panel about fair housing legislation. So I want to turn to introduce the panelists and sort of get them to each make a few opening remarks, and then we'll go into questions. So the first panelist I want to introduce is Senator Cory McCray. He was elected to the 45th, to represent the 45th legislative district in Maryland in the state Senate. And that was in 2018 after having served in the House of Delegates for 4 years. He's right now the Deputy Majority Whip, and he serves on the Budget and Taxation Committee. Those are my favorite. These are the money committees. And Senator McCray is the first vice chair of the Maryland Democratic Party, and he is a uniquely Baltimorean. I don't know if I can call you that, but you have a unique Baltimore story, because at the age of 18, you were in an apprenticeship. You became a member of the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers. You have been working for a long time, and you continue working for the union and as a community organizer even to this day. So I want to turn it over to you, Senator, to hear any opening thoughts you might have, and then I'll also introduce our second panelist and let her say a few words.
Yep, Nani, first let me just say thank you for the warm welcome. I'm humbled, I'm honored to be able to be joined by Madam Assistant Secretary and also my friend Barbara Just thank you for this opportunity to be right here virtually with you all on this very important discussion around fair housing. When I think about fair housing and I think about the state of Maryland, let me be very, very clear. When we look at our urban jurisdictions, Nani, and we think about the historic disinvestment that has happened over a period of time in those neighborhoods, we know that we here at this moment have to overcome those challenges. How has the state been overcoming those challenges? We've done it through a number of tax credits. We've done it through a number of grant programs, but some of the more successful ones that I would like to lift up is things such as Bernie, the Baltimore Regional Neighborhood Initiative, Nani. And I think about Speaker Bush when he had his vision in reference to putting this in place and putting together the work group to make sure that we think about affordable housing, but the things that indirectly impact those. What does it look like to have healthy food options? What does it look like to preserve and keep our seniors in our neighborhoods? Making sure that we can look at the facades that's also there. Looking at how the appraisal gap a lot of times affects, because even if you wanted to go into that neighborhood, that house may cost, you may get it for 10 or 15,000 and you invest 40 or 50,000, you still wouldn't be able to turn that home around and make a decent profit, let alone a significant profit. So knowing that the state, our local government and our federal government have a responsibility to step into these neighborhoods, Nani, and make sure that we do that piece of it. I'd also like to lift up, while we're doing work on the state, it's important to recognize that our local jurisdictions are doing equally that. And in Baltimore City, they have the Affordable Housing Trust Fund, which is served as a great vehicle, especially for our land trust and affordable housing, fair housing from that piece of it. Nani, I could go on and on and on, but I will not. I'm going to make sure that we get the questions in so that we can dig into it. But once again, I'm humbled and I'm honored to be able to share this moment with you.
Thank you so much, Senator. I really appreciate it. And I know we'll have a lively discussion. Thank you for being here. I also want to introduce the other panelists here. We have Acting Assistant Secretary Jeanine Worden. Welcome. She is the Acting Assistant Secretary for Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. Just a little bit about Jeanine's background. For 10 years, she served as the Associate General Counsel for Fair Housing in HUD's Office of the General Counsel. And prior to joining HUD, Ms. Worden was a manager in the Civil Rights Division of the U.S. Department of Justice, where she supervised investigations and litigation and directed the Justice Department's Project Civic Access initiative that was aimed to remedy state and local government noncompliance with disability rights law. And also, she has experience working at a major Washington, D.C. law firm specializing in civil litigation and advising clients about federal, state, and local civil rights laws. So welcome, Assistant Secretary Worden, and I'll give you just a few minutes to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what you're working on.
Thanks so much, Nani, for that great introduction. I'm also humbled and honored to be speaking and joining this panel. I hope we have a robust discussion. Full disclosure, I much prefer doing speaking engagements in person so I can gauge the reaction of the audience, but I'm going to give it my best. So I want to start out with the Fair Housing Act, since that's what my office is in charge of enforcing. And I'm going to do a little quick rewind and take us back to 1968. And I'd like to share a little bit about myself. So in 1968, I was one of 4 kids in a single parent family, low-income family. I was in the 8th grade. It was a time of great racial unrest. We experienced as a country the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King, and the Fair Housing Act was enacted. And the Fair Housing Act is a great law, and it's a great friend to affordable housing, and I want to talk to you about that. But I also want to do a little bit of level setting and straight talk here. So I told you how old I was now, and I could tell you that while there has certainly been progress through the Fair Housing Act and other civil rights laws, there are also some things that I know from my experience haven't changed as much as the Fair Housing Act intended them to change. So the Fair Housing Act was put in place to undo the patterns of segregation that exist in the country because of efforts that occurred through government actions at the local, state, and federal level. And it was also put in place to give equal access to opportunity for people of color that had long been denied. It was supposed to advance home ownership opportunities. And it was really supposed to create an equitable society. So now I'm going to fast forward us about 53 years to the current time. And I'm going to tell you that when I look at fair housing issues from a national level, I still see a lot of segregated communities. I see a lot of schools that are still segregated. I attended a low-income school. I actually attended a low-income majority minority school, and I also attended a school that wasn't low-income and wasn't majority minority. And I could tell you that the educational experiences were different then, and I can tell you that the educational experiences are different today. The opportunities just are not the same. And so one thing I'm going to say is this is not a negative message. This is a positive message. The Fair Housing Act is a great friend to affordable housing. And now is the time when we really need to use all of the levers that the Fair Housing Act gives us to address these systemic issues. And I am hoping that over the next 4 years, we are going to look at these issues in a really very intentional way. And, you know, so building affordable housing, maintaining affordable housing, preserving it, this is hard, hard work. And I'm a pretty straightforward speaker, so I'm going to say it. There is a stigma about affordable housing in the community. And it's not just because it's low income, it's also because of the residents who lives in affordable housing. And so we really need to combat the stigmas, and we need to change the way that we're doing business. And I really want the Fair Housing Act to help us do that. So when it comes to placing a concrete factory in a community, these days what people do is they look for the low-income area, and that's often the majority minority area. And so you end up with populations that are unduly burdened with the industry, with the factors in our community that aren't really viewed as the opportunities. The investments are very unequal, as the senator mentioned. There has been major disinvestment in communities of color and investment in majority white communities. And that's just the way it has been. And what we need to do is we need to work with our tools in the Fair Housing Act to change the way we do business. And we have to start thinking about this at the federal, state, and local level. And so when we're thinking of where we place the factory that's going to burden the community with air pollution, we need to think of it as something that the community needs to own, and not always give it to the people with the least power in the system. So they're the ones who are burdened with this. And when we're thinking about affordable housing, we need to think of it as an investment. We don't necessarily need to put it on the land that is the least expensive land in the community. We want to think of it as an investment in giving our families opportunity. And so we want to put it in a place where either the opportunity already is, or where we're going to build the opportunity so that children growing up in that housing have the same opportunities as children across our community. And I'll leave it there and we can talk.
No, this is great. Thank you for these ideas. And I would love to get Senator McCray to tell me a little bit more about Baltimore. You know, we heard some ideas from Assistant Secretary Worden, and I know that Baltimore is doing a lot of interesting things to achieve racial equity in housing and actually increase opportunities in neighborhoods. Can you talk a little bit more about what you see happening in Baltimore and if you want to in Maryland, because I know you also have statewide hat on too.
Yep, Nani, great question. So in reference to Baltimore, I like to talk about just a couple things, and then I'm gonna work my way back over to the state piece of it. So that affordable housing trust fund, I scratched the surface at it. That is a fund that was built off of land development deals at a certain price. I want to say $1 million or more. And making sure that there was a higher assessment on that to make sure that it actually funds affordable housing. So that was what it was supposed to do in prior administrations, wasn't actually achieving that goal. And then the intent of the city council was to make sure that folks knew what we were trying to achieve. And from that, we've seen where that Affordable Housing Trust Fund, just the allocation that just more recently went out, we have 3 land trusts. And we saw each and every one of them land trusts appropriated $750,000 from that land trust. So those monies have brought in several $1 million. It started out as 2 million, it then worked its way up to 7 million, 3.55 until it hits the $7 million trigger. So that's a pot of money that the city council has intentionally said, this is a broken system and we're going to make sure that it works for Baltimoreans. And I thought about it, Nani. Yes, I'm a true Baltimorean, very unique Baltimorean, because I'm born and raised in that city and still reside there. And then the next one that I would like to lift up is what we call the NIF fund, the Neighborhood Investment Fund. This was where our prior mayor had taken our parking garages. So our parking garages, city parking garages, and decided to do them for long-term leases. And through that long-term lease was a certain amount of revenue that was raised to be able to invest in certain community funds for kind of like growing and bandwidth of communities that don't traditionally get to organize or things of that nature. But the other piece, the NIF fund, the Neighborhood Investment Fund. And what this Neighborhood Investment Fund is work on when developers, nonprofits, and they're putting together these deals and they find themselves at the last 5% gap and can't figure out where that is. That neighborhood investment fund can even recycle that money back and give like a 0 interest loan for a certain period of time, or it can set it up as a grant to make sure that we can see that these development deals that are working for people, that are working for Baltimoreans, actually come to some form of fruition instead of just trying to figure it out with those larger parts of the deals. Because we know, Nani, that when we're trying to put together these hard deals in the communities that have been historically disenfranchised, but not just a year, not just 10 years, but decades on top of decades on top of decades. And for folks that may not know, if you are from Baltimore, I'm talking about Darley Park, I'm talking about South Clifton Park, I'm talking about Berea and Oliver, just so that you can really understand the context of where we're speaking to at this moment. Nani, I'm going to now transition over to the state. And I scratched the surface with the Bernie program. But that Bernie program has been so successful through the partnership of the legislature, Department of Housing and Community Development. It's went from 3 million to 9 million over the time that it has been in existence. But because of its success of making sure that you can creatively find different ways to invest stuff from a holistic standpoint into these neighborhoods and thinking about what does it look like in these specific areas that have traditionally been left out. We've now watched where Montgomery County and Prince George's has put together their own Bernie. Now, Nani, they didn't choose to use the word Bernie to do theirs. They call theirs NED. So this is like the National Strategic Capital Investment Economic Development Fund is what NED stands for. But that is a creative way that our state of Maryland has put in place to where funding can come through the system. And that can help with homeowner assistance. So we know that when we have home ownership, opportunities, that this is what actually pushes neighborhoods in a great manner, I should say. Sometimes it is that appraisal gap that I talked about earlier, making sure that sometimes you just need that supplemental dollars to make sure that you can put these deals together. And then on top of that, sometimes we use our capital grants program. We call them bond bills back home. But I can think about a neighborhood such as the 4x4. So that folks understand this is 600 row homes that's inside of this community. 150 of them are actually vacant or in some type of deterioration, and we need to make sure that we correct that. And how do we correct that, Nani? We've been able to make sure that that land trust that I'm talking about, Northeast Housing Initiative, is engaged and been able to award them dollars. Habitat for Humanity has also come into this neighborhood to be able to help, but also St. Ambrose. St. Ambrose does a significant amount of housing and able to push them in there. And Nani, when I talk about this, I'm talking about intentionally pushing them in 4 streets. This is only 4 streets that we're talking about, and make sure that we push that development and be very intentional. Nani, people, especially elected officials, they say they pay attention to everybody, but that's not true. They pay attention to people that vote, and they pay attention to neighborhoods that vote. And when you have such a large cluster of vacant homes, that's indirectly impacting these people that may feel as though voting is important, and we have to shift that trajectory. But most importantly, we have to shift because everybody pay taxes. I don't care whether you're poor, rich, or in the middle. But a lot of times we do not see our dollars from the federal, local, and state coming back to our neighborhoods. And that is wrong on all levels, Nani. I could keep talking. I don't know when the limit is, but I do think that I've talked a significant amount, and I'm going to make sure there's some more questions.
I very much appreciate it, Cory. And if I could just say to the audience, what I noticing some are raising their hand, but what I really want you to do in a few minutes is just put some questions in the chat box. In about 10 to 15 minutes, I'm going to kick over to some of your questions. And so just write them in the chat. I will be monitoring them, but we won't get to questions just yet. I wanted to turn over to, so thanks so much, Cory. Really loved all of what you're highlighting here. You gave us a lot of ideas about financing tools, and particularly, and you know this probably better than most, which is when you're really trying to fund developing more housing, there can be a gap. So some of the tools you talked about were really kind of trying to finance that gap and target it. But what I also liked hearing about was the 4x4. I think what you're saying with that is we have, 600 units of housing. We have a significant number of them that need to be refurbished. You don't want them to be vacant. And so you're taking a place-based approach to this that I think is really valuable and really interesting. If I could just say to Jeanine, I wanted to get from you your kind of perspective on what you think the primary drivers are to achieve racial equity in housing, however you want to define that, but tell me what you think can be done.
So there are just an enormous number of things that can be done, and we have nowhere near enough time to talk about them, but I'm going to start with a few, and hopefully that'll spur some ideas. So I think we need to take a look at the procedures that are in place that serve as impediments to affordable housing being located in areas of opportunity. And I speak of this as a fair housing person. There are zoning and land use laws, and there are procedural requirements, and there are sometimes notification requirements that can be a barrier. And I believe I mentioned before that there are some stigmas about affordable housing. Those are not rational stigmas, come on. And one of the things that the Fair Housing Act can do is come in and help with sometimes educating people on what it's legal and what it's not legal to do. It's not only about lawsuits. Sometimes we achieve really great results in getting affordable housing sited in perfect opportunity areas because we've come in and done some education of local officials and helped them understand that even though it may not be exactly what their constituents want, it is the right thing and they need to do the right thing. So the second thing I would talk about is NIMBYism. We have to address that. we have to help people understand that affordable housing is a necessary part of our infrastructure and an
I know we're all
investment in
housers
the
here,
community.
Jeanine, but
And
NIMBYism, just define it
Yes.
for 1 second. Yeah. So not in my backyard, right? NIMBYism. Uh-oh.
Sure.
Okay, yeah. Sorry.
It stands for not in my backyard, meaning that a lot of property owners come forward and they don't like things like affordable housing located near them. And so, and typically the argument raised is it's going to negatively affect my property value. And I think we need to, number one, help people understand that that's just not true. And number two, help people understand that you can't object to having affordable housing in your community because you think it is somehow going to change your community in a negative way. It's not going to change your community in a negative way. It's going to enrich your community by providing greater opportunity in the community. You know, the other thing I would say is if there is affordable housing, that one of my favorite types of matters to see coming before HUD or when I was at the Department of Justice was affordable housing that was facing a block, because there the Fair Housing Act can help. And really getting in and doing the hard work and helping the local community understand that, you know, the burdens that come in, like the industrial plants I was talking about before, those need to be shared by all. The opportunities that come in, the great schools, the great places for employment, those need to be shared by all. And there needs to be much more equitable distribution. And that's where some of those fair housing rules, such as the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule that you mentioned, Nani, come into play.
Thank you so much for that. This is really helpful. I wanted to shift over just a little bit. First of all, just to point out to the viewing audience, Cory, Senator McCray has put 3 resources into the chat box if you're interested in more information about some of the tools that he has mentioned, including Bernie, the Affordable Housing Trust Fund, and NED, which evidently is modeled after Bernie. So, but I do want to shift over just briefly to legislation. I think this is supposed to be a session about fair housing legislation, so would love to know, I'll ask you first, Senator McCray, what kind of legislation are you aware of moving forward at the state level to address housing shortages, disparities, or equitable housing growth?
I guess that one I like to talk about, one that currently passed in 2020. So not this past legislative session, but the one before that. I'm going to lift up my friend from District 20, Senator Will Smith. And I'm also going to lift up, because when I was in the House of Delegates, it was Steve Lafferty and Maggie McIntosh really pushing this effort in reference to the HOME Act. So as our Madam Assistant Secretary stated, we know that when all poor people live in one neighborhood, that's how you don't have healthy food options. That's how you don't have the bookstores. That's how you have educational challenges and things of that nature. So we know that when we have mixed communities from an income standpoint, that we all benefit from this. And this is exactly what the HOME Act was doing. It's making sure that you take those places of opportunity and making sure that anyone that has a voucher have the opportunity, not just to focus or cluster in one neighborhood, that you have the ability to spread out from that standpoint, and making sure that landlords can't discriminate from a person that has a source of income. So they cannot discriminate from a source of income standpoint. So I'm glad that this took several years to get passed. Actually, I was in the House of Delegates for 4 years, and it was put forward all 4 years, but it did not pass until my second year. So that was at least 6 years while I was there that this legislation had been taken. And you saw it kind of pushing on a local level to kind of push up on that state level. So you saw a number of our local jurisdictions actually took action to get to the point that we're in at this moment. There's a significant amount of money that was coming from the federal government at this time, where I've sat on a number of work groups from the state of Maryland and working with our DHCD, but also the city of Baltimore in reference to the ARP money that's coming. So making sure that that can kind of come from rental assistance and things of that nature is something that we also dealt with this legislative session.
Thank you for that. That is really fascinating. And source of income legislation, I'm glad to see that it's moving in Maryland. Urban did actually a HUD-funded 5-year evaluation of the voucher program, housing choice vouchers, and we found that it was actually very hard across the whole country to use a voucher to find a place to rent. And in fact, some people were, they finally got off the waiting list and got their voucher and couldn't find anywhere to rent. So we had also looked at some communities that had source of income provisions in place, and those communities had more supply of housing. So that's to rent and in more diverse neighborhoods. And so that's I'm really glad to see that that's moving. I want to turn over to Assistant Secretary Worden and just ask you just the same question, and really kind of take it a little bit more to the job you're doing now. As President Biden has called on HUD to assess the moves made by the prior administration on fair housing, and just kind of ask you how you think President Biden will implement and enforce the Fair Housing Act maybe differently from prior administration.
Thank you. That's a great question. And again, there are numerous things I could talk about, but I will talk about a couple of things in particular as much as I can. So two of the things that occurred during the last administration related to rules that existed under the Fair Housing Act that had been put in place during the Obama administration. One of them was the discriminatory effects rule, sometimes called the disparate impact rule. And that's a rule that prohibits policies and practices that have an unjustified discriminatory effect against people on the basis of protected class like race or national origin. And during the last administration, there was a total rewrite of that rule, which kind of turned it into a rule that couldn't be used to combat covert or unintentional discrimination very effectively. However, the U.S. District Court in Massachusetts stepped in before that rule became effective, and it was stayed, never became effective. And so the other rule that the last administration worked on was the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule. And that was done in the Obama administration in 2015, and it talked about place-based strategies and improving access to opportunity. And what the last administration did was come in and totally redefine what it meant to say affirmatively furthering fair housing, so that it didn't even require anything fair housing related at all. And really took away a lot of the process for fair housing planning that communities need to go through if they're going to make change, intentional change over time. And in April, HUD announced that it had submitted to the Office of Management and Budget 2 rulemakings. One was a notice of proposed rulemaking relating to the reinstatement of the discriminatory effects rule. I can't say anything more than that. The other was a notice, it was a proposed interim final rule for the restoration of the definitions and certifications related to affirmatively furthering fair housing. And for those who don't know, really the definitions require communities to look very holistically about the issues of equity in their community and how funds are being spent, and where investments have and have not been made, and what improvements have or have not occurred with respect to changing segregation patterns. And the certifications are really a mechanism that the statute requires, that everyone who receives HUD funds make a commitment to advance the policies and purposes of the Fair Housing Act. And so I can tell you that those are the titles of the rules. That's all I'm allowed to disclose. But the action was very quick. I think you'll see between January and early April, and fingers crossed, we'll see more action soon. The other thing I could tell you is that President Biden has asked us to do a systemic review within HUD of HUD's own programs. And we're looking there for ways to increase equity in our programs. And I think it's not only HUD that needs to do this. I also think it's HUD grantees that need to look at this. You know, in terms of the community development block grant funds, what communities are they being directed toward? Are you doing code enforcement in primarily low-income communities where your code enforcement efforts may actually be putting people out of housing, as opposed to really increasing housing or doing anti-crime work in that community? And when I say anti-crime work, let me explain that a little better. There's a practice that has occurred more and more across the country where jurisdictions have enacted laws that they call anti-crime statutes. And what happens is people who live in affordable housing, if they call for 911, those 911 calls are used as a signal that crime is occurring in a neighborhood and that the people who live in that housing should be required by the housing providers to leave. There are jurisdictions across the country who use those so-called anti-crime statutes to take action against people they consider undesirable in their communities. And those people are typically residents of affordable rental housing. And that's what I was talking about when I was talking about stigma in the fair housing space and how we need to use the fair housing laws to address that. But we also need to use the fair housing laws to provide a lens for how we're using funding. Is all the community development funding going to the preservation of home ownership at a time when we know there's a huge home ownership gap and there are far more homes owned by whites than by Black and brown people? If so, maybe then we should take a look at how we use potential homeownership funds differently, maybe thinking more about helping people who are first-time home buyers who otherwise would not have the opportunity to become a homeowner, get the kind of investment that allows them to pass wealth down through the generations. Those are the kinds of things that HUD is taking very seriously to heart as we implement the president's executive order on racial injustice and equity in underserved communities and underserved populations.
Thank you so much, Assistant Secretary. And I really, if you have not yet read President Biden's executive order on racial equity and racial justice, it is really far-reaching, and it is directing every agency to do what Jeanine is mentioning here. So this is a really important executive order, could direct and drive funding from the federal level down into communities. I am going to turn to some audience questions. I've got a few here, and if anyone has any, please put them in the chat box. I'm monitoring. I won't have time to ask them all, but I'll do my best. The first one I think could be directed to Senator McCray, but of course, Assistant Secretary, if you have any thoughts here. This is really about how do you get more community representation on committees? And so one question is directly about Maryland having racial equity committees, but really not doing the best job, including people who are housing choice voucher recipients or homeless residents with lived experience. Can you speak to that a little bit? This could be a problem across, but just wondering about Maryland, if you know anything about that, Senator.
First, Ms. Miller, this is a phenomenal question. So it takes a certain level of intentionality. And I think that when you have diverse legislatures or council folks, and when I say diverse, I'm talking about young, I'm talking about gender, I'm talking about ethnicity, I'm talking about all around, we know that we have a better product. So one of the highlights that I just want to put forward to give you a clear example of intentionality is when I mentioned that Affordable Housing Trust Fund. I went and looked up the 12 commissioners and the requirements for those 12 commissioners, and I'm going to take the time out just to read how intentional they were when they put it there. It says one of the members have to have experience in the field of housing, community development, planning, social service, or public health. a member of the lending community with experience in community development and affordable housing finance. DHCD commissioner or designee, that's traditional. But here's the one that I want you to pay attention to, and the one after that. A resident who rents and is at 30% or less of AMI. A resident homeowner who is 50% or less AMI. A homeowner who received assistance through an affordable housing homeownership program. A social services provider, a representative from a homeless service board, low-income family, fair housing advocate, nonprofit, affordable. So we saw that at least a quarter of those positions of those 12 commissioners were very intentional to make sure the community that is affected is actually sitting at the table. And that's a clear example. But I do believe that you have the legislative opportunities, especially when we're creating these boards, state, local, or federal, where we can designate out and kind of push out what we're and make sure that that fair representation is there. I hope
Thank you so much for that. That's really fascinating. And just for, I know we're all housers here, but you know, AMI is area median income. So if you're below 30%, that means you're making less than 70% of the people in your area median income of, you know, as less than of the area median income. So that is a way to direct, actually federal funding is sometimes directed based on this, but it sounds like this committee on that is directing the Affordable Housing Trust Fund is also using this measure as a way to get residents that are not all wealthy on the trust fund direction itself. So that's really wonderful. I have a question here that could really go to either of you. So I'll have either Jeanine or Cory or both of you answer this one. This comes from Diana. It's how can we encourage directing housing investment that will benefit BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color, individuals and families who want to live in neighborhoods of opportunity? And either the senator or assistant secretary could answer that. It's a hard question. And you've already kind of given me some ideas here, but you want to say anything further?
So I definitely think the fair housing planning process brings a lot of opportunities for people to think about where to place housing. And I really do think that, you know, as previously noted, we need to think of our affordable housing as investments in our future and create places that are desirable to live. And, I don't have a magic formula to make hard things happen. I can bring the Fair Housing Act to bear as a catalyst to help make things happen. So a lot of it is really in the community, I think, where many of these efforts need to occur. And the more we have representation of disenfranchised populations on boards and in our legislative bodies, the more this is going to occur.
Yep.
Thank you.
Just to piggyback on Madam Assistant Secretary is we talked about the HOME Act. So the source of income and making sure that we can't discriminate and utilizing that as a vehicle to stay out of communities. And then I just wanted to say, like, for folks that may not know, and I know that Nani touched on it, but the state of Maryland has a $51 billion budget. And we have to be very intentional when we're talking about that. It's 13 members on budget and tax. And then when I think about the city of Baltimore, it's a little over $4 billion. And I tell you, each and every day that I wake up, I think about those disenfranchised neighborhoods from a historical standpoint, way more than I think about those that do have as much access as they want. And I think that that's one of the vehicles that we can make sure is through our budget opportunities that we have in the legislature and back home on our local jurisdictions.
Thank you for that. And I'll just add to this, just because it's something we're very interested in at Urban. You know, there are a lot of practices that are what we would call exclusionary zoning. They're basically zoning to kind of keep people out. And so we, again, with the zoning lab that we're launching in the fall, we really want to encourage people to look at evidence-based inclusionary zoning ideas that boost housing supply, but also boost kind of more diverse neighborhoods. We believe will lead to more equitable sort of recovery and equitable neighborhoods. And that's kind of, and again, it's very hard for the federal government to impact that, but there are ways in which it can. And so that's sort of where Urban's energy is right now, in terms of giving people tools to try to do that.
So Nani, I did want to mention that a lot of the time when we talk about fair housing, we only talk about the Fair Housing Act in land use and zoning cases, since HUD is the funder of a whole heck of a lot of states, counties, and municipalities. We also have jurisdiction under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act that prohibits discrimination based on race, color, national origin. And I think this is an underused tool, and I sure hope you're going to be seeing HUD using that tool a lot more going forward.
Yes, I remember that tool well, and how we weren't using it so much before. So thank you for that plug. This is a very technical question, and this I'm going to apologize in advance. I'm only having time really for one more question, with the hopes that both the senator and the assistant secretary will say something about it and any wrap up they want. But this is a technical question that came just to me, but it's really for you all, which is just pointing out that one of the tools, and you all know this very well, is the low-income housing tax credit. Those are allocated through qualified allocation plans, I believe determined by the state. It's a federal refundable tax credit, but it's used in localities to build affordable housing. But oftentimes those plans can embody policies that incentivize developers to build affordable rental housing in areas of opportunity. So this is basically a thought that came from an audience member that basically says, hey, here's a tool. So just wanted to kind of hear from both of you, anything you want to say about LIHTC as a tool, and or a federal role or a state role in sort of addressing some of these issues that we've talked about here, and then any wrap-up comments you want. And I'll start with Senator.
Thank you. I think that LIHTC is a phenomenal tool and that we can utilize. And one of the challenges that we have just with LIHTC, especially in urban jurisdictions, is that these are singular development deals. So we have a number of scattered sites. So we may have a block, it's 20 houses on that block, 16 of them are vacant, 4 of them are filled. We need to still address those issues, and we would like to see LIHTC help with addressing those issues. One of the things is we actually did budget language. One of the bigger nonprofit developers, Rebuild Metro, found this is a reoccurring issue to help get rid of the blight in our neighborhoods and put budget language in to say that we have to prioritize scattered sites when we're talking about LIHTC, so these tax credits piece of it. I would be remiss, Nani, if I didn't lift up Senate Bill 155. I'm going to put it in the chat, but let's think about those young people that are homeless. And these young people are homeless, but they've still figured out how to get around adversity, and they've actually gone and applied for some form of a university, some community college. But we did with Senate Bill 155 is make sure that our state institutions that get our money, so they get money from taxpayers, actually, when they know that that homeless youth is there, that when they're doing the waiver, that they're actually thinking about if they can live on campus and putting them at a major priority for that on-campus institution, because we don't want that as one of the barriers that's there. My colleague, Senator Mary Washington, put that forward. It was significant debate on the floor about it, but we did see that it was bipartisan. So there were some Republicans that stepped in and agreed that, yes, if those young people that face these types of adversities of being homeless and they're still trying to seek out their education, we as taxpayers, we as the state of Maryland have a responsibility to see them through and thrive, and they should get priority housing on that campus that they're applying for.
That's fantastic. Thank you for both comments there. It's really, really fantastic and good to highlight Senate Bill 155. Sounds very innovative. Jeanine, do you have any thoughts about either LIHTC or any of the comments that we've had so far, and any wrap up that you want to give us as we're rounding the last minute?
I absolutely want to come in and speak about LIHTC. And what I want to take us back to is the President's order on racial justice and equity and underserved communities and populations. I definitely think it's a program that HUD and our colleagues over at the Treasury Department need to take a look at, because it's such a primary driver in the affordable housing space. And we want to take a look at how the QAPs are allocating the opportunities that are going out there. Is all of the housing being used for seniors? Is there family housing being built? Where is the family housing being built? What's being incentivized in the QAPs? And I would certainly hope that we would see those issues being addressed going forward.
So thank you so much. We have run out of time, but I want to say very huge thank you to Madam Assistant Secretary and to Senator McCray. Both of you have just been so wonderful, and really nice to have both perspectives here, or all perspectives here, because you brought to me some city, some state, and some federal tools, which are very diverse tools, but actually work together. As Jeanine keeps saying, the Fair Housing Act is a friend to affordable housing, and I believe that to be true. And so that is wonderful. I want to point out to audience members that Senator McCray, in true Senator fashion, has put his email in the chat. So, you know, we ran out of time here, but he put his email there in case you want to just like send him a note or something. I'll be sending him a thank you note. I want to just kind of turn it over really quickly to Diana Eisenstadt, who brought all of us together here. Go ahead, Diana.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me? Am I on?
Yes.
This has been just a really terrific panel, and I appreciate your time and talent, and we'll be sharing it. We'll be posting a recording on our website, which is something that, so this conversation will live on for quite some time. And we look forward to partnering with you, and I have that email, Senator, so I know where to find you. There's, you know, much to be done, and it's been a very, you know, very challenging time in the housing space, and we can only hope that we're turning the corner, and the money will go out before the eviction notices is all. That'll close on that. Let's get the money out first. So again, many thanks to all those of you that joined in and for sharing your wisdom.
Thank you so much, Diana. She comes in like the voice of God here on the side. So thank you so much. And thank you so to my panels. And I think in the chat box is also a link if you all want to navigate over back to the rest of there's another breakout session at 1:15. So thank you, everybody, and I'll sign off and say goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Ms. Worden. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you.
Bye.